Superman kicks off a brand new DC universe with the new Superman and David Corenswet, a new director at the helm in James Gunn, and really an entire universe relying on how this movie ends up performing. I am so excited to finally talk about Superman, as it was one of my top 3 most anticipated films of the entire year, arguably the biggest film releasing in 2025. So let's get into talking all things Superman. Should you check it out? What do you need to know going in? What did I like, dislike? Let's do it. Now, normally in my spoiler-free reviews, I have sections based on elements of the film, but I'll be doing a full spoiler breakdown of the entire Superman film coming out this Friday. So instead, this video is going to be very simplified for you. The good, the mixed, and the bad, along with my final score and recommendation at the end. Before we get into it, as always, let me know all of your thoughts on the new Superman film in the comments down below, but let's get into it. For context, I've always found Superman a very interesting character, balancing being a human but also this all-powerful alien, and I think some elements of that were done really well in Man of Steel, but Batman vs. Superman just wasn't my cup of tea at all. And after this, I am just eternally jealous to every 12-year-old that gets to grow up with David Corenswet as their Superman, because with James Gunn at the helm of this one, this is the absolutely perfect superhero adaptation in my opinion. I've read some Superman comics here and there, but I'm more of a Batman and Spider-Man type of guy, and what's always tied those characters so deeply to me is their humanity and how all of their character work just hinges on them being vulnerable. And Man of Steel did everything but make him vulnerable. He was really just aura farming for like 4 hours. But this knows exactly how to make Superman a human, and not only how to make him vulnerable, but how to make us as an audience member really care for this all-powerful being that at times can just be really annoying to watch if he is just beating up on every single guy and not having any real political turmoil or any sort of like mental battle with how to execute using his powers. That's kind of what all the adaptations as I was growing up did. This one does the opposite of all of that, and at times I think it's doing a little too much and it feels a little bit too bloated, but I'll get into that later. I want to start off with the good of this film, and that obviously starts with Superman himself, David Corenswet. He's absolutely amazing, the perfect casting choice for Superman in my opinion. I will say the marketing feels a lot more, do we need a Superman? And it leans into the politics a little bit of that, and so does the Man of Steel Zack Snyder adaptation of it. But unlike that version of Superman, to me, every physical limitation or every physical battle that David Corenswet's version of Superman faces, rather than actually just impose a big ass kaiju to try to fight him like they did in BVS, it's just more so breaking down a personal element of the character rather than just being this on the surface he's not strong enough. In the past, James Gunn has said that this is a slightly weaker version of Superman than what we've seen before, and in this film itself, they say that he is the most powerful metahuman that they have encountered thus far, at least these like 3 decades that this universe has kind of existed. And I'm, number one, very interested in the power scaling of this universe and where we go from here with the future installments. But also, I think it just makes Superman much more interesting. It's not necessarily that it's just small things that make him get hurt, but they are throwing every single piece of equipment that they have at this guy. They're literally doing everything on Earth and extraterrestrial to stop Superman as a being and try to contain him and to figure out what his goal is and all these. And the final quick thing I'll say about Superman is there is little to no Clark Kent in this film, and to me it kind of worked, similar to the way that there was little to no Bruce Wayne in the Batman. And there's one scene specifically where a character says, maybe next I'll kill Clark Kent. And that's the only movie quote I'll use in this entire video, but that to me very much resembled a moment in the Batman between the Riddler and Batman in the prison. And I will talk more about that in detail and talk more about what I think that means in my spoiler review / breakdown of the entire film, because can't get into too much of it without spoiling, but it genuinely, again, further pushed the idea in my mind that, yeah, James Gunn understands his character. Yes, these can be 2 separate characters at times, but their thematic ideas, morals, and this idea of hope and what they both find to be vulnerable, Superman and Clark Kent, that is important. And they are not just 2 separate characters like they have felt in previous adaptations. With the character of Superman overall, I think the way that he just carries this sense of hopefulness and idea that he just trusts humanity much more than they should be trusted works really well in my opinion. It's not as much of being dismissive of evil as it is just believing in the most good possible, and I think that's a great character flaw to have, especially for an all-powerful being like Superman. I think the way that Clark is very emotional emotionally charged here about political ideas and what Superman should and shouldn't be doing. I really, really like that. And I don't want to make this automatically about Man of Steel, but it felt like in that movie he was kind of just standing there aura farming, letting things explode behind him to look cool as shit. But in all seriousness, I genuinely felt like there are so many defining moments of David Cornsweet's version of Superman that has real emotion and a passion and an understanding of human life and the value of it. Even though he is this extraterrestrial being, he understands that he is here to protect these people. And that idea does 100% come across within the first 15 minutes of this film. And the final thing I want to say about Superman is very deeply tied to Lois Lane, played by Rachel Brosnahan, who does a phenomenal job. I think she's a little bit sidelined, so I'll talk a little bit more about that in the mix section of this video. But I think the political and economic, the ideas of how she challenges Superman in all those different ways makes up for her lack of screen time. There's an argument scene that I absolutely love, and I haven't stopped talking about it since it was shown in one of the trailers. It is much longer in the movie and it's amazing, but that scene alone really does embody the hopefulness that Superman has. And I am so happy that they were able to kind of wrap up all of these Superman ideals and ideas into one trying to convince Lois Lane that Superman is right type of conversation, which I think is very necessary between the relationship of Clark Kent and Lois Lane. I just think the way they execute it here in relation to the politically charged story that's going on, it all just is executed so perfectly.
You seemingly acting as a representative of the United States.
I wasn't representing anybody except for me
around the world.
And doing good.
I would question myself in the same situation and consider the consequences.
People were going to die.
And speaking of the politically charged aspects of this film, I want to talk a lot deeper about like the parallels and ideas that James Gunn is trying to convey here. And I'll do all of that in the spoiler review because I don't want to get into specific story points here. But this is about immigrants. It's about territorial propaganda. It's about driving countries against one another, engaging in literal war crimes, all while also being anti-billionaire propaganda. I think this is James Gunn finally taking a full political swing. And not even James Gunn. Really, this feels like the first comic book movie and big Hollywood blockbuster to take this type of political swing. To me, it is a 1-for-1 representation of what is going on in the real world right now. And I've seen this term go around a lot of this is like politics for kindergartners. Like it's very introductory. I don't understand how else you can execute this level of political allegory in a comic book film. The way I view it is if James Gunn was to half-ass it and, go 1.5 of the way over the limit and be like, these things are generally similar, kind of similar to what Captain America Brave New World did, in my opinion, where it really teeters a line and never tries to cross over it at all, staying so far behind. And I don't think it's the idea that people will be put off by the 1-for-1 world representation. I think it's more so people are just like, we couldn't have made it any more complex. You know what I mean? Like, where is the detail in this? I think it's perfectly executed. Like, you have this billionaire that's trying to control parts of the government to become an all-worthy ruler. It's kind of exactly what's happening right now. Anyways, again, I'll mention that more in the spoiler review, but I do have to mention how this film kind of looks, feels, is paced, how it engages the viewer, because it all follows under one umbrella, and that is, it is just a comic book come to life. And I've used that statement a lot on this channel. I used it for the Batman, and I feel like for a lot of movies that is still the case. I still agree with that for the Batman. I think The Flash is also a really great example of that. The Black Adam is also an interesting example of that. And as you can tell, a lot of the movies I'm noting are DC movies, whether they're in the DCEU, DC Universe, and Elseworlds film. It feels like they're always striving to build a universe and build a world or build a city or build a character or side characters or write their worlds into being and feeling like they're ripped out of the comics. Now, with certain characters, it works in different ways. For Batman, in my opinion, it works in building Gotham out. Here, they build Metropolis out, but it's more so based in just a very strict visual style and how it is just very unique and interesting. If I'm not mistaken, the same cinematographer that worked on The Flash actually worked on this film. and I found this out after watching the first trailer for the film, and I was a little bit worried, I can't lie. I think I had mentioned this in my initial trailer reaction back in December, but the CGI doesn't really fall into the traps and potholes that The Flash did. It feels like this movie in general is just way more polished, so that visual style of using 3 different cameras and the different lenses and being able to switch between all of it and capturing things in a bunch of different color palettes, whether it's the Daily Planet or those fights in the outside of Metropolis or these pocket dimension idea things that are going on. It's all captured so uniquely in my opinion. And to an extent, it does make it feel a little bit like a Saturday morning cartoon / TV type of pacing. And I'll get more into that in just a second here, but I think it's all worth it. I think you go all in on the comic book feeling, and I think it works. And with the pacing, it just feels more like the way that Peacemaker was paced in terms of characters and how, in Suicide Squad, of how these characters are evolving over the course of the runtime, rather than something like the Guardians films, which I feel like is the inherent comparison for where Superman could go just because of how sci-fi based it is, rather than what the Suicide Squad was trying to do. And the movie is also kind of shot like Peacemaker. There's a couple of sequences that really reminded me of Peacemaker because it's just more grounded than what Guardians of the Galaxy is, even though it is so sci-fi and insane. Guardians of the Galaxy basically all takes place in space. Only really an act of this film takes place not in Metropolis. And a couple of other smaller things I did want to mention. I really liked the multiversal-esque plot point in the second act. I won't get into detail on that because there's a lot of spoilers to talk about there, but I thought the use of Metamorpho and the characters surrounding Metamorpho and just the whole idea of how this film is able to elevate from not necessarily grounded by any means, but more so like a contained Superman fighting Superman-like villains, like big mechs with laser eyes or kaijus and all that kind of stuff. That is awesome. But when you go to some multiversal idea, that is a completely different section. Like even the MCU took a while to take that step into that bound. And I think this kind of just feels like they're moving at a breakneck pace, so they're able to introduce all of that without it being too jarring. And then finally, Nicholas Hoult as Lex Luthor is absolutely amazing. He not only gives a phenomenal performance, but he's just one of the most like hateable comic book villain performances I've ever seen. And getting into my mixed thoughts on Superman, this starts with the writing of Lex Luthor, because as hateable as he is, as amazing a performance Nicholas Hoult does give, I do think he is just still so one-dimensional. And I think Lex Luthor as a character in general is fairly one-dimensional. I think certain adaptations of Superman can be one-dimensional, but he has other sides to him. Lex Luthor doesn't really have that, and with how much is going on in this film, he just kind of feels put to the side, and he has these really great moments. But overall, since the film has so many like episodic-esque ideas and villains and kind of like a week-to-week formula going on, Lex Luthor kind of gets put on the back burner. And the connection between Lex and this multiversal plot, once you see the movie, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. But it goes to prove that this movie kind of just feels a little bit too lived in. I completely understand the vibe that they're going for this DC universe, that it is already lived in. We are moving at 150% speed to try to kind of not catch up to what Marvel is doing, but trying to set up our world. And they do an amazing job. There's an exposition dump in the beginning of the film, kind of setting up what Superman is, where he's been, what he's done thus far, and the state of metahumans, I guess. And the words gods and monsters comes up, which is the title of the first phase / section of the DC universe. And to me, that really worked, and I found it interesting. And right away, I was like, I hit the sit up meme. I was very intrigued. But at the same time, it proved in my mind the point that this feels like a Superman 2. It does feel like we missed a lot of world building, and they try to play it off by including a lot of exposition moments, which as a fan of comic books, as a fan of this genre, I didn't really mind that at all whatsoever. But I just found it really interesting, and I'm a little bit mixed on the fact that they rely so heavily on exposition dumps, but also I kind of really liked it and made it feel like a comic book. And another thing I'm very mixed on is Ma and Pa Kent. They're not in this movie for nearly as long as you'd think, and I think a big part of that is just because we don't get a lot of Clark Kent, and the arc that Ma and Pa Kent play of being his parents and this difference between his Kryptonian parents versus his Earth parents, that arc still plays out similar to what I had expected, but I just kind of think that they took such a big swing with one aspect of his Kryptonian origin that obviously this isn't an origin movie, but it's just like a plot point. But they take a swing with it that does just end up with less Ma and Pa Kent, which that's one of my favorite aspects of the Man of Steel film and generally adaptations in comic books with Superman and Clark Kent in it. It feels like a good, heartfelt home to kind of go to, and this film doesn't necessarily rely on it. It doesn't lack heart, but it just doesn't rely on Ma and Pa Kent, which I thought was different. And the final thing I'm pretty mixed on is just the fact that there is a lot going on. Now, I'm recording this after I've seen the film one time. I will do my spoiler review after I've seen the film a second time, so I'll have more cohesive thoughts on this. But there was just so much happening. The kaiju metamorphose subplot, Lex's like secret prison that he's built, black holes, multiversal ideas happening and being thrown around everywhere. It's just a lot going on. And at times, it just feels like too much. But finally, getting to the bad, I really only have 1 to 2 main flaws that I didn't necessarily think of right away in my out of theater reaction, but it's definitely something that is kind of sitting with me and I just don't like it as much. The biggest thing for me is just the sci-fi scale of this film. It's so normalized and it's so, we already live in this world that kaijus are breathing fire and there's this big ass dude with a laser helmet and buildings are getting blown up and falling over on each other. And I get it. In comic books, these people still live in these cities. These places are still very occupied. You look at Gotham. Why the hell would anyone live on Gotham? But anyways, it's not necessarily a problem with this specific movie. It's more so just the idea of being desensitized to big, scary things. Because once the people of the city are desensitized to these things, it feels like as the audience member, I don't really care because it doesn't seem like they care. And Superman is supposed to be saving these people. We're supposed to see them as people that are getting threatened. When Superman is saving them, I love it. He saves a dog, he saves a squirrel, and he saves a bajillion humans. But in the moments outside of those specific saving people sequences, it does feel like we are cutting corners with tension just because of how lived in this world already is. At the end of the day, I absolutely loved Superman. I think this is the perfect adaptation of the character, probably my favorite Superman film to date. I think it's one of the better comic book films of the entire decade, and just overall, I think this was the perfect start to the DC universe. Overall, I'm going to give James Gunn's Superman a 9 out of 10. I definitely think this rating will probably go down by 0.5 or up by 0.5 after my second watch, so stay tuned for my spoiler review coming out later this week. That wraps it up. Again, let me know what you thought of this film in the comments down below. Very, very excited for more people to talk about it, but that wraps it up. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Peace.